Today is New Year's Eve. It's the last day of 2025. And what better time to look back on the last year than today? And so that's what I wanted to do in today's video. Today, I'm just going to recap some things that happened this year, some lessons that I learned, some things that I'm noticing. And my hope is that by going through some of those things, they might be helpful for you as well, or just serve as a good reminder for the future. So the first topic of the year, without question, is AI. AI is something that has been top of social media, of news, of just discussions with people. Everybody's trying to figure out how to use AI. And I think the reality is we're still very much in the beginning and just trying to figure it all out. I think this is something that's going to be really interesting to look back on in a few years, or maybe even this time next year, to see how things have evolved. But I did take some notes here on some of the common use cases that I'm seeing actually with clients and with teams that are using this. So some of the best use cases I've seen as of today for AI is in the actual coding process, with debugging code, with getting help to write a particular query or change some logic somewhere. And I find people are using it very similarly to how you would just use ChatGPT for searches. But instead, it's while you're typing, you might not know how to write something, or it might give you an auto correct on something to help you quickly change your code or debug an error. It kind of finds it for you quicker. So in that sense, it's helping people be more productive on the tactical coding. It's also helpful to expedite some of the tedious aspects of development. So maybe there's consistent naming conventions, or creating a bunch of files or a bunch of lines of code that are all the same. It can very quickly figure out your pattern and create things for you. So a lot of that is happening within the code editor itself, but also in a lot of tools now, they're offering support, or you can ask questions on how to write a particular line of code, or maybe try to figure out what the function is if it's a database, and you can just ask a question and it will write it for you or give you some suggestions very quickly. I think these are things we're all already used to, but absolutely something that's happening. Another area I saw this was with PR checks, so pull request checks on things like GitHub or GitLab. So the AI goes through and understands the context of the code that you're trying to push through and create documentation accordingly. It will run a bunch of specific tests and all these different things to really just cover all of your bases. In this particular case, there was a lot of things happening that I really wasn't super familiar with. So it felt a little overwhelming, but it was something that they were comfortable with and was doing a lot of different activities on their behalf. So I think that's a great use of AI in this workflow. So AI is definitely helping teams be more productive in the sense of development and automation and documentation, those kind of things. But there are still a lot of areas where it's just not quite good enough yet to be really threatening your job, I guess is the way I would put it, if that's something you're worried about. And I say that because here's the other side of some of the things I'm noticing. While it does give you the results for the development, for the debugging and all that stuff, when I go in and I look at what it is suggesting, it's really not optimal a lot of times for what you really should be doing in that situation. It's going to give you an answer, but it's really just not quite the best way to do it. The concern here is that teams are kind of blindly relying on the output that AI is giving them, and they're going to create this house of cards of logic and systems that are working technically, but nobody really quite understands why it's doing something. And then when things break, it just becomes more patchwork. So that's why I think it's still incredibly important that you really actually understand what's happening and can interact well with this AI tool to know whether or not it's giving you something that is optimal or makes sense for what you're actually trying to do. And then the other part of that too that I've noticed is some people will spend more time trying to get AI to give you the right answer. And I'm as guilty as anybody on this. I've done this with not just development, but other things in life where it would have just been more efficient to do it myself or think through it and actually solve the problem rather than try to maneuver my conversations with the AI to give me exactly what I wanted. It's a little bit of a handicap in a way, and also just inefficient use of your time if you're spending more time trying to get something else to give you the answer than you to just get the answer yourself. So again, it's a balance, but these are things that I'm noticing, and I think that most of us are probably experiencing the same thing right now. But to end on a positive here, I do think AI in its current form today is really helpful for helping teams get from 0 to 1 on certain topics, or to kind of boilerplate your code and get some things going. But you still need to rely on your human instincts and understanding and strategy and nuance to be able to work with it effectively, not just accept it and let it do everything for you just yet. Now, moving away from AI, one of the other trends I've noticed this year is how teams want to use their data, and in particular, analytics versus operational use cases, or at least that's how I tend to think about it and split up these conversations. And let me explain this a little bit further. So a lot of teams are looking to take data that they're adding to their data warehouse, their pipeline of analytics, and be able to send it back to the operational tools or the business applications that they're using. I think you could summarize this under this concept of reverse ETL. That's a term that's come out in this industry over the last few years. And this isn't necessarily a new concept, but it's the design implications of some of these things that I'm starting to notice are becoming a little bit challenging for teams. And it's kind of leaving teams in the middle ground of what they want to do. So on one hand, you have your analytics pipeline, and that's the typical grabbing data from your sources, moving it through a pipeline, and then giving it to a report. You're kind of looking back and analyzing things that happened. Typically, that's a batch process, more or less. Maybe it's an hour, maybe it's once a day, whatever the cadence is. But then once that's in place, the next thing that teams want to do is say, hey, we're combining this data from these different sources. We want to use that new custom field and send it back into the CRM, into the business application tool, and use that new column there and make sure that it's the same across all these different tools that we're using. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You want to use consistent metrics and column values wherever you can. But the challenge of that becomes that teams no longer want that information just once a day or once an hour. They want to see it pretty near real time, every 10, 15 minutes. And of course, that makes sense again. But the challenge of that is, again, because we are trying to combine sources and run logic to get that column in the first place, if that's coming from multiple sources, you're starting to blend almost real time with your batch, and you have to do all of these sources together to get what you want. It's really challenging a lot of times to just get one or two or a few columns real time, but then have the rest of your pipeline just be on a batch. You kind of have to do them together a lot of times. And again, I don't think that this is an impossible task. It's something that can be done and teams do it. But the teams that I'm working with who are requesting this typically only have 1, 2, maybe 3 people on the team. To build that type of architecture requires a lot more complexity and skill set and management to keep that going and all of those integrations and the real time aspects. But I find that a lot of times it becomes more complex than what teams really need, especially at the start. The other option that I think would work well for teams is just to be able to wait a little bit longer. And maybe that's just not possible, but I think a lot of times it is. Just wait to have that data refreshed and loaded back to other tools at the end of your pipeline. So maybe that means you have to wait an hour or a few hours or once a day to get that custom column back to the app. If you do it that way, you're going to keep your engineering pipeline a lot simpler. You can use some of those out of the box reverse ETL tools and still get the result. But I recognize it's not as real time as you might like it. So again, that's just something I've noticed on a few different teams this year. And it's a good sign that people want to use data in these new ways. There's more business buy-in on getting this customization. And so it gives us more to do and more to focus on and just new challenges to solve as data engineers. The next note I have here is on one of the big mergers that happened this year in the data world, which is DBT and Fivetran merging together. And this is something that I don't think is really surprising. I think there was a lot of discussion over the last few years on what was going to happen with DBT at some point. Somebody was going to acquire them or they were going to merge in some fashion. And so some initial thoughts here is, as a user of the tools, I'm hopeful that they will continue to operate as individual tools and that you won't have to be forced to use both of them. But at the same time, I understand if that's what happens, but we'll see. I'm hopeful that they'll remain unique tools, just maybe under the same holding company of some sort. I guess we'll see. As of today, I haven't noticed any major changes in, at least with, let's say, DBT. The DBT projects are operating the same. Teams are able to start new projects and do all the things that they would have done before the merger as they would now. But I guess we'll see what happens over the next year or so if anything changes. So I don't really have any extra insight or thoughts around this merger other than I hope that both tools continue to be successful. And I really do hope that the open source community and just the uniqueness of DBT in particular continues to be available for teams that want to use just that. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes over the next year or so. All right. So the next note I have here is on design and strategy, and the fact that this is an area that teams still are looking for a lot of help on. And I think that this is something that's going to continue to be an opportunity to help teams with. And I say that because even today, there is so much information. There's tons of information. There's no lack of content available to learn things. There's AI that can give you any answer you want in a second. There's social media posts. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got something new to announce of some sort. But at the same time, it still requires teams to think through all that information and make decisions. And not only to make the decisions, but to stay consistent with what they're doing. So a few of the areas that I've noticed teams still struggle with today are in project design. So, how are they coming up with naming conventions and structuring things? AI and things can help expedite that and can help you with that. But at some point, you need to take control of that. And if you're not personally able to do that, or as a team, you're not staying on top of that, it still becomes a problem. And it's something that I've noticed as I've walked into some teams where things have clearly gotten a little bit astray. The same is true with query design. There's inconsistent query development. You would think that this would be a solved problem. With AI, it can just read all your code and give you solutions. While an AI can absolutely look over your project and give you recommendations, there's still certain things of context and nuance that it's very difficult for a computer to really fully understand that. And so that's where teams are still looking for an extra set of eyes to understand their strategy, their vision, and then apply it and make sure it's consistent all the way down to the technical implementation. And that leads a little bit into this last point here, which is personally, I've shifted a lot this year to focusing on one person data teams or very small data teams with maybe 2 or 3 people on it at most. And I've really enjoyed leaning into that type of group, that type of team. They're all facing similar types of challenges, which is a lot of the stuff that I've mentioned here. And I think that's where most of us work. There's just a lot of people that I'm hearing from that are saying that they are that one person team and they are struggling with a lot of the same things. That's an area that I personally enjoy helping those types of people and those smaller teams with, and the companies that they represent. It's a little bit more hands-on, you're a little more involved rather than a bigger company where there's more decisions to be made. There's a little bit more red tape. It's not to say one's better or worse. I just tend to prefer that. At least it's something that this past year or so is an area that I've leaned into and have found really enjoyable. But I've also worked with both. So I've seen both sides of this. And it's been really rewarding personally to see the impact that you can have when you're working directly with a team that's really small like that. Or again, it's a one-person team and they're able to take the advice and use it and see a real impact quickly. And what I've noticed a lot with this group is that they're not necessarily looking to have somebody do the work for them. They want to own the process themselves, but they just need a second set of eyes or maybe some advice on how to go about it. But that has been a nice shift for me this year compared to previous years where maybe it was more heavily hands-on development. I still absolutely get into the code and will offer hands-on development where it makes sense. But generally speaking, it's been a nice shift for me this year. And it's something I'm looking forward to continuing going into 2026. So that brings us to the end of this video and to the end of 2025. I hope you have a great new year. Thank you for being here. I wish you all the best in 2026. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.